On July 13, 1966, a young woman named CORAZON ATIENZA made the fatal mistake of opening her apartment door to would-be brutal mass murderer and rapist Richard Speck. Under the guise of needing help, a clearly inebriated Speck was allowed entry into the girl's room, where he quickly took Atienza and her roommates into the bedroom at gunpoint and continued to rape, stab, and mutilate them for 6 hours throughout the night. At one point, CORAZON managed to get out of sight from Speck and hid under a bed. The most horrifying moment of that night, though, was hearing the assault and murder of one of her roommates in the bed above her. Speck left the next morning, still too drunk to realize that he had left Atienza behind. The young woman began screaming for help and was quickly rescued by her neighbors, who discovered the carnage Speck left behind. The killer was found after having left plenty of DNA evidence at the scene, and after he checked himself into a hospital due to a previous suicide attempt. When he learned, he left Atienza alive. After being caught by the authorities and given his day in court, a jury took only 49 minutes of deliberation to sentence Speck to the electric chair. However, the Supreme Court later overturned the death penalty due to Speck's inebriation at the time of the murders. He was given 8 consecutive terms of 50 to 150 years. He eventually died in prison, showing no remorse for his senseless crimes. As dramatized in the 2007 David Fincher movie Zodiac, Bryan Hartnell is one of the few survivors of the infamous and notorious Zodiac Killer during his murder spree in the 60s and 70s. While lounging about a picnic area by Lake Berryessa in Northern California, Pacific Union College students Bryan Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were approached by a skittish man dressed in all black, posing with a gun, and raving about his past crimes. The assailant, who later would call himself the Zodiac Killer, proceeded to tie the 2 students up and force them on the ground. He repeatedly stabbed the 2 of them until both fell unconscious. After the crime, the Zodiac Killer himself called the police and informed them of where they could find the bodies. During the incident, Cecilia managed to see under the killer's mask and provided a description for a sketch artist just hours before she died from her injuries. Hartnell survived, but was unable to provide any description because he was not at an angle in which he could see underneath the Zodiac's mask. While the Zodiac Killer was never identified and brought to justice, Hartnell went on to become a probate attorney with a family of his own. On a cool evening in 1997, Holly Dunn and her boyfriend Chris Meyer relaxed after a party by sitting by the railway tracks and stargazing. After deciding they had stayed too late and attempted to go home, they were suddenly approached by a man who seemingly came from nowhere and demanded money. Meyer responded that neither had any cash with them and then felt an ice pick against his neck. The mysterious man turned out to be the Railway Killer, a murderer hunted by the police who utilized trains as his method of transportation and had since left a trail of nearly 30 bodies behind him over numerous state lines. The Railway Killer tied the couple up and threw them into a ditch next to the train tracks. He then proceeded to drop an enormous rock on Meyer's head, killing him instantly. He sexually assaulted Dunn and then struck her repeatedly with a blunt object, causing her to fall unconscious. The killer, having believed he'd killed both of them, disappeared into the night. Dunn awoke hours later and reported the crime to the police. In 1999, the Railway Killer, real name Angel Resendez, surrendered to the authorities and was put to death in 2006 by lethal injection. In 1992, 19-year-old Jennifer Asbenson hitchhiked a ride into work where she had the night shift. The man who picked her up, Andrew Urdiales, offered to both take her to work and wait until after her shift so she could return home. Asbenson, surprised at her luck, agreed, and Urdiales took her to her job without incident. However, after Asbenson's shift, she returned to Urdiales' vehicle where she was quickly threatened with a knife to the throat. The man drove her out into the desert, dragged her to an even more isolated location, cut off her clothing, shoved her underwear into her mouth, and sexually assaulted her before strangling her unconscious. Thinking her dead, Urdiales proceeded to stuff the woman into his trunk and planned to return home. However, Asbenson awoke while in the trunk and found the trunk's release mechanism. She managed to pop it open and leapt out of the speeding vehicle, rolling into the pavement behind her. Several cars passed her by before she finally managed to stop a marine truck by standing in front of it. She was taken to the hospital and reported urticalis to the authorities, who managed to evade arrest until 1997. In 1984, a woman named Rose Stewart awoke to a terrifying sight. A man named Dean Carter held a knife to her throat and told her his evil intentions. Carter proceeded to repeatedly rape and assault Stewart for 5 hours, causing her to lose consciousness twice. When she awoke the second time, Stewart attempted to escape by acting as though she liked and enjoyed her assailant. With an iron will, Stewart even feigned a kiss for the man, causing him to believe she would not tell of what he had done to her. Carter left the woman without killing her, and Stewart immediately ran to her neighbors, where they contacted the police. Over the next 18 days, and before the authorities could find Carter, he would go on to rape and strangle 5 women up and down California. When he was finally captured and sentenced to death, Stewart shockingly motioned that he be excused from the death penalty and be sentenced to life without parole. This put a rift between Stewart and the families of the other victims, and Stewart has been highly criticized for opposing the jury's decision. As of the time of this recording, Carter still faces the death penalty, as his sentence has not been overturned.